Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thanks for watching. Is the mic okay? Yeah. Okay, good. I think I'll just pass it to you all. What? Yeah. Oh, great.
Hi. We've shown a lot of videos here at the Sanctuary, a lot of documentaries, a lot of them depicting scenes of injustice, as your documentary did. And after going home upon watching them, I think a lot of audience members and myself as a camera person just feel obviously very depressed and kind of hopeless. A lot of them don't really tell us, so what do we do now? And neither did this one, yet somehow I don't feel as hopeless.
Okay.
And
I like this question.
And I noticed one thing that's different about your video is that it doesn't really focus on one concentrated area. It's more global. You like went to different countries and different states and got different perspectives. And I'm just wondering, I don't know if anyone else feels less hopeless if they've been to any of the other events, and I'm just wondering why that is, because like, what I concluded from this, instead of just Chicago sucks, it's like, the world sucks. And yet somehow I'm not feeling as down.
Wow.
Do you have any explanation for that?
And you said you're a camera person.
Yeah, I'm supposed to be on camera 3 right now. I'm going to go back over there.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Your remarks really make me happy, I have to say, because I think it's a really tough thing to do, to present the problems of the world in a way that honestly reflects the gravity of the situation and the suffering that's going on, and that kind of avoids 2 traps. So one is the trap of hopelessness, and the other is like the trap of like, oh, here's the solution right at the end. And so many films do this, right, where there's kind of this sweeping narrative of a problem, and then right at the last 5 minutes, this music kicks in, and there's kind of a montage, and maybe you'll see people holding hands in the streets, and okay, but people power can still get over this issue. And so, I was really conscious of trying to tread that line. And I think for me, probably the scope is part of it, right? It's like we are part of, this is a global situation, this problem is really big, and yet I think there's, what I tried to do was give both a sort of historic and geographic scope that would say, but nonetheless, progress has been made, right? Nonetheless, against great odds, we have gotten somewhere, even if the progress that's been made is precarious and can go into reverse. And, and so this is, that's also the theme of the companion book. So I wrote the book while making the film simultaneously. And in the book, I'm able to be more sort of explicit about my thinking and my sort of analysis going into this project. And so each chapter in the book is a paradox or a tension, I think, is kind of central to democracy and will be with us, even if we manage to improve a lot of our situations. So, we'll always have to wrestle the needs with people living now, with people who haven't been born, so there's always going to be a temporal struggle. We're always going to have to balance the local with the global, so there's always going to be a geographic struggle. Like, as human beings, we live in a place, and yet we live in a global world. We'll have to balance structure and spontaneity. How do we plan, how do we make rules, but also how do we allow things to sort of rise up and have these rebellious moments that actually are, extremely democratic. And the sort of coda of the book is optimism and pessimism. How do you reconcile those two? And I sort of invert, there's this classic Gramscian thing, right, which is I'm a pessimism because of intellect and an optimist because of will. And I feel intuitively I'm the opposite. When I see the crisis before us, the climate crisis, the intense concentration of wealth, the way capitalism inherently concentrates wealth and undermines political equality, my will actually really weakens. I just feel like I'm just one person, what can I do? It's by engaging my intellect and looking at history and looking at the fact that people have fought and won that I start to feel more optimistic. So I think, the film is in that tension, and I think, and I think by, it consciously tries to avoid overwhelming the viewer with negativity, but also tying it up in a bow that is ultimately, too easy and not intellectually credible. So, that was a mood I consciously wanted to try to capture, because I also wanted to make a political film that I felt that if I was a viewer, I would feel was true to the many dilemmas we face.
I really enjoyed the film.
I'm really happy that it was her first movie.
Yes.
Getting in there. She's going to be like, I love paradoxes. I love tensions. I love philosophy.
I swear I didn't bring her up just as a prop. So I have a pretty narrow question, actually, because I thought that was a good, like, wide-ranging starter question. So Wendy Brown seems pretty confident that we need these boundaries for democracy to work, and I'm wondering why. And then, kind of related to that, I'm wondering how localized democracy can effectively change the systems at a broader scale, at a global scale. It seems like kind of a big ask to go from really local to, you know, global climate crisis and refugees, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, so I included that conversation with Wendy and I because I think she throws down a really interesting challenge in that moment. And it is actually the last exchange of our long conversation. So my producer is literally pulling me out of the room as I'm talking to Wendy and just being like, Astra, you have to wrap it up for once, you know? You know, and I challenge her, right? In the sense that I'm like, okay, but we are living in a world where capitalism has written essentially like an economic constitution for the world that has no democratic accountability. I think Wendy's challenge, so I did some events with her in San Francisco and got to dig into this more. I think she does believe that democracy has a scale problem, and that's part of a long tradition in political philosophy, right? This is something political philosophers have argued about. You know, is democracy inherently a sort of face-to-face phenomenon, and does something go wrong as it gets bigger? My sort of gut reaction to that is, well, I've been in a lot of dysfunctional small groups, you know, and I can think of lots of, you know, large-scale rules that enhance democracy. I would like to see international climate accords. I would like to see an international tax collector, you know, limiting financial transactions, right? So I think, to me, I tend to think of scale as more of a strategy. You employ it based on what your sort of what your goal is, not kind of viewing one scale as inherently virtuous and one as inherently sort of villainous. Nonetheless, I think she makes some interesting points about democratic accountability and knowing, you know, do I have to be involved in every democratic decision? No, there's lots of communities I'm not a part of, and I don't need to be involved in their decision making. There's also, you know, I think there is danger in universalism when it is, just like kind of incoherent. So there aren't really structures for 7 billion or 8 billion people to make decisions, right? We're going to have to scale things up. And then there's an imperial dimension too, right? Whose democracy is being, is the one that's sort of encompassing everyone else. There's all sorts of movements that resist inclusion, movements for First Nation sovereignty, movements, you know, decolonial struggles, right? Not everyone, there have been lots of cases where citizenship has been sort of forced on groups, compulsory citizenship. So I think the historical record shows that it's actually a very complicated issue. As far as the scaling up question, I think the thing is there's no way around it because, again, we live where we are, and we have to figure out ways to engage where we are that connect to the global. This is what climate struggles are doing when they're bringing protests home, or when indigenous communities are fighting for territory, you know, control over natural resources. I mean, we have to somehow make these global struggles local and figure out how to bridge that gap. So I think, you know, for me, that's one of the problems of our time, and that's part of why I'm also attracted to organizing around indebtedness, you know, thinking back to the workshop I gave this afternoon, because it's a way of tying our individual conditions and, you know, the payments we make every month to these massive, not just national, but international financial structures, right? It's a way that these global structures are felt very intimately. So I think there's a lot of complexity in that exchange. I don't think Wendy and I totally see eye to eye, but I also think her comments, you know, can't be dismissed. And, you know, we don't know whether democracy can be globalized. We know capitalism can, right? We have to keep experimenting. But I think to me, it's a question that jury's still out. And, you know, I dream of the lefty idea of the international is a beautiful idea. We haven't figured out how to do it.
Yeah, wanted to ask you if you had explored, Lonnie Guinea, I think, said something to the effect that, you know, a moving majority makes for a good working democracy.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that is a concept you explored and put away, or if anyone brought it up.
What majority?
A moving majority.
A moving?
A moving majority, yeah. So it's not constant, where it's constantly changing. So if a group of minorities with similar interests,
Yeah.
and it doesn't have to be on race and
Yeah,
very
yeah,
traditional lines, with similar economic interests, could actually make a much more better functioning democracy than one that is stagnant. And
Yeah.
I think that's the fear that people have, that as this division grows, that you're, and especially with inheritance and things of that nature, that you have a very stagnant majority. And that's what makes a democracy not so functional. But if you had a moving majority, it would be a very different case.
I really like that. I mean, I started digging into her work towards the end of writing my own book, so she's not a scholar that I'm extremely familiar with. But I mean, you know, my gut reaction to that concept is that there's something really interesting there. And, you know, in these dialogues that I'm now having as I go around with the film, we sort of resort to this idea, it's interesting who does it, but this idea of the fear of the tyranny of the majority. And I think that right now that's a fear that I hear a lot from actually sort of rather protected liberal people. And they feel like there's a populist moment, and there's populism on the left, and there's populism on the right, and they see these things as like two equal things. And usually in that context, my argument to them is, no, I think the problem right now is a tyranny of a stagnant minority.
Exactly.
A minority of extremely rich people who this country has always been built to protect their interests. And they, you know, the majority of American people want action on climate change. They actually, polls show that people are actually more open to immigration than they have been since 1965 in this country. People would like universal or public health care. So actually the majority, when you poll Americans, the majority is pretty progressive, right? So I like that. I mean, my reaction is that I quite like that, which is...
And that's the optimistic side, too.
That's the optimistic side. And so if you think of majorities as, well, actually majorities are made up of lots of different minorities, right? Then that's interesting. But to me, the big threat right now is this minority of the super rich who have erected all of these veto points. So it's that stable minority, and maybe...
Okay, full disclosure, I'm a Wall Street banker, so sorry. I would apologize. But essentially, going back to the global and things happening at the micro level and at a global level, what happened during the crisis was started with AIG not understanding that debt securities or credit derivatives do not operate like floods in one zone. So they priced it thinking that they could, that if some securities went under, the rest of them would be independent. And that's not what happens. It's a global economy. So similarly, if you look at the reverse, it starts off very, very locally and spreads globally in an instant, right? Reverse, there's banks in Spain that went extremely local, and that is a horrible model in terms of an insurance approach. Because one little industry goes down. A lot of people after the crisis went back and said, let's keep it local, let's put boundaries, let's put walls. And that's horrible for banks, because you're now not diversifying your exposure. So all your exposure is concentrated in what happens in this 5-block radius. Guess what happens if something happens here? Then the whole, you know, all the local banks go under, the local merchants go under, and hence. So going back to your point, and you questioning Wendy over there, I thought was important, because we are much, much more global than we can. So there's no going back.
Yeah, I think this is why I say the issue to me isn't scale. It's, well, what is the banking sector doing? I mean, we have a financial sector now that is 30% of the profits from the financial sector are about fees. They're not even anything to do with productively investing capital or anything like that.
I think the focus is wrongly focused on just banks. It's all institutions at a very high level. Their corporate interests across the board, and it doesn't. Even not-for-profits have the same problem as a for-profit company or a publicly traded.
But the financial sector has ballooned in relationship to the rest of the economy since 1979, the year I was born. So I think, I mean, to me, I think the problem is the economic system, which includes many other companies, many other industries, but the finance sector has grown disproportionately, especially to any sort of productive. I And what we have is an entire industry that does not create value, but extracts value through rents, through speculations, through creating assets, through taking mortgages, cutting them up, securitizing them, betting on their failure, and passing them off as productive assets when they're toxic. That's, I mean, but that is what happens.
I don't want this conversation, but I'd love to. Happy to.
Yeah, but
does the audience want this discussion now?
No, but I mean,
No,
I think to me, banking is, you know, it's I mean, the film is an hour and 45 minutes, so it can't get into everything. But I think, you know, the financial sector is disproportionately powerful right now, and is one of the many, and the financialization of every aspect of our lives is, you know, I think a problem. But I don't think the answer is in the local. I agree with you on that.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Hi, I had two questions. One was, I can't remember who said it in the film, but they mentioned kind of in the genealogy of democracy, the importance of indigenous governance in the in what we call the, right. So I was just wondering if you write about that more in the book, or if you could talk a little more about that. And then my second question is kind of more personal to my work. I work with a lot of students, and they are so full of amazing ideas. And going back to the first question about kind of what do we do kind of thing, and I think there's a trillion different great ideas, and one of the big things that get in the way is debt. And that's the number one thing I hear every day from students. And they have all these passions, and then they go and take a job that they feel is incredibly compromising of their values, often because they feel that they're just so burdened by this debt that and then maybe someday they'll pay it off in a decade, and then they'll do something that they feel is ethical and great. And so I just wanted to hear a little bit more of what we talked about in the workshop with the Debt Collective, and how that is trying to intervene in that issue.
So two separate things. So the first, I think, you know, Sylvia Federici in that scene, so she talks about how this idea of freedom actually, you know, that sort of the Western philosophical tradition takes credit for, actually only emerged out of contact with indigenous communities. And I mean, I think there's absolutely no doubt about this. This is also something I go into more in the book, but it definitely, you know, multiple things. One, it made me aware of just how much work I had to do to sort of decolonize my thinking, and still do. But that, you know, there are contributions to, you know, political philosophy that are so crucial and undervalued. So if you're thinking about Europe at the time where, you know, the ships are heading over, it's like nobody was thinking about equality. The whole, like, inequality was just as natural as could be. You know, there are kings, and there are peasants, and there's, like, you know, the people who had the church, and there's, you know, the followers. And so it was through contact with other cultures that even the idea of equality and also freedom from the monarch even started to sort of evolve, percolate as an idea. So there are lots of books sort of written on this, documenting the sort of profound influence of indigenous cultures, even on sort of the founding fathers. And, you know, I mean, this is also, you know, this is something I'm sure everybody knows, which is on the idea even of federation and uniting the states. But, you know, it's not an idea that just sprung from Rousseau's imagination. And Rousseau was extremely familiar with all of the literature. You know, and it was literature that was not sort of, you know, anthropological or ethnographic by our current standards. Some of it was like fantasy and projection and romanticization and weirdness. But then a lot of it was people talking about, you know, what they saw and trying to account for it. And so that's, I think, an interesting point. On the debt front, you know, there's another long history is the relationship between debt and democracy. And going back, so even, you know, in this film, it talks about ancient Athens. Of course, the Athenians didn't invent the practice of democracy, but they did invent the word that we use. So, you know, the riots that Effie, that's the woman's name, the second woman with the red hair, that Effie's talking about, you know, those were riots over indebtedness. And, you know, there are these historical accounts that are basically like everyone owed money to this one guy, and, you know, and they were being sold into, you know, debt peonage, debt slavery, and so there were these riots, and that was sort of the riots that precipitated the dawn of Athenian democracy. And it's a motif that happens again and again. It happened in ancient Rome. Look at the relationship between debt and democracy in a place like Haiti, right? How there was the Haitian Revolution, which was, you know, in a way, what should be held up as this sort of like paradigmatic democratic revolution, the first multiracial democratic revolution, punished with, you know, a huge debt allegedly owed to the French. Look at the way debt was used to suppress sharecroppers in the South, right? I mean, so debt is like used and mobilized again and again in this very anti-democratic way. Which isn't to say all debt is bad. Debt is good when credit's extended on fair terms and helps you expand the present and, you know, make productive investments and all this stuff, but it can be used in very anti-democratic ways that sort of impinge on the future or tie up the future. So it's not a surprise to me that, that the students you meet feel that their future is being foreclosed because they're committed to making these payments, you know, month after month for 30 years. And, you know, it's been in the news a lot because of Elizabeth Warren making her announcement that she wants to cancel, you know, student debt for anyone up to $50,000. You know, when she said something like, when I went to college, I paid $50 a semester, right? So her future wasn't constrained in the way that young people going to college are feeling today. So, I mean, I think the solution is to organize and to mobilize around the issue. And, you know, we've certainly, I think, seen in the last 10 years a huge shift in the way, you know, student debt is discussed in this country, and taken it from being sort of natural that it would just go up and up every year to now being, you know, the issue of like total cancellation being actually in the mainstream media. So, you know, yeah, I think your students should be more angry. That's what I would tell them. I mean, I think it's like a total fucking outrage that they wanted to go to school and they're stuck paying, you know, Sylvia Federici would be much more blunt. She would be like, so they go into debt to get a degree so that then they can work an unpaid internship, you know, in order to possibly have the right to be exploited for a wage that might go pay back their debt. Yeah. I mean, I think people should be more mad. Yep.
Hi, my name's Wayne.
Hey.
I'm going to have to crouch. I want to compliment you.
Yeah.
Over the last 5 years, I've become more politically involved, and your film showcases the most articulate members of our society, children, prisoners, and refugees. Not to put down Cornell West. But,
it's pretty good.
but I found all of those people had far more understanding through direct suffering and exploitation than any of my privileged middle class, or academics.
Yeah.
So I would hope in the future you might spend even more time with them.
Yeah.
Solution, lottery. You spend very little time with it.
Yeah.
At least for me, that is democracy, people power, demokratia, not elections. And the Greek, as you pointed out, or your host pointed out, elections are oligarchic. They elect the oligoi, the conspicuous few. So in public education, I'm public educated, they never tell you this. I think it's the central issue, because if we had a lottery system to elect presidents, senators, anyone, school boards, we'd have 50% women. You know,
well, you wouldn't have a president the way that we have it. So they had a sort of fleeting figurehead who served for a day, and his job was just to say like, "Hey, welcome." But you know, you would share power because you wouldn't want some random person to have all of the power. You wouldn't you wouldn't select a dictator.
But as far, as appointed, my understanding was they would appoint, say, a military chief on pain of death.
Yeah.
But the idea of a lottery to pick your elected official implies inherent respect that anyone has the capability to be as good as anyone else. And I think that's the most impressive and brilliant idea. And yet it's, as I say, it's given very little time in the talk of democracy, because, you know, you can't turn on a TV and not hear democracy 6 times by whoever's on TV, that we're in a democracy. But it's not.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, we do have sortition or lottery. We have a sort of phantom limb of it in juries, right? That's one place where it lives on. And so juries are this sort of vestige of that model that has carried through. But I think there's a lot of potential in looking at sortition, because for me, if I thought people were being randomly selected, I sure would want more public education. I'd want it, people, if you were like, okay, people are going to have real power. But then there is actually quite, a lot of academics have been working on this issue, and citizens' assemblies, randomly selected citizen assemblies, have actually been called up in Ireland, in British Columbia, and deliberated on important issues, and people actually come to pretty interesting determinations.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of evidence that it's a good method. On the sort of non-philosophers, academic divide, absolutely. I definitely agree that people from privileged backgrounds had less to say that was insightful. I mean, I think there's just something when you've experienced more of life, you have more insight into how the system works, how power operates. As I was finishing the book, I read an essay by W.E.B. Du Bois, who Angela Davis mentions, and it's a beautiful essay called Of the Ruling of Men. And he talks about excluded wisdom. And excluded wisdom is the wisdom of working people, of black people, of women and children. He's very wonderful on this point, and that he says children as well. And he says, excluded wisdom is the wisdom democracy needs. It cannot be democracy without this excluded wisdom. And of course, W.E.B. Du Bois argued for industrial democracy. He was a socialist at various points, and he knew that this wisdom could only be included with material support. It wasn't just about sort of focus grouping it or taking a poll or whatever, but really incorporating it into the structure of society and sharing power. But I think this idea of, who's an expert, the film is designed to challenge this idea of who's an expert at democracy, who sees how power really operates, who knows, and to make the case that, we're all capable of thinking philosophically. And in fact, one thing, I went into the film and tried to speak to every person as though they were a philosopher, right? To ask them about truth, to ask them about wisdom, to ask them what they really thought. And people were so grateful and responsive. They were so, like some people would say, I've never been talked to like that before, right? And so I think there's also just a real appetite for engaging about ideas and the things that matter. And so that was also a beautiful part of the experiment, was just really, talking to people. And I thought I would have to do more. I actually had this idea that I would have everyone in a philosopher's chair to sort of signify, I'm showing you, I'm treating everyone like a philosopher. And you see it in one shot with Abid from the refugee camp. Abid, who people often mistake for almost like a worker at the camp, but in fact, he's a refugee from Afghanistan by way of Pakistan. He's only ever gone to the 2nd grade, right? He's just, he's got an incredible facility with language. And so he's in this chair that I dragged all over creation. And then I didn't need it as a visual motif because it's in the camera work, it's in how I'm talking to people. But that was, I think the film is, in that, there are many arguments with Plato happening, but one is, his idea of, the set of philosophers, not just kings, he wanted philosopher kings and queens, because he thought democracy marginalized the wise. And, my point is, well, no. Wisdom is, I think genius is as common as dirt, but we live in a society that doesn't, I think that's part of the scene with the kids in the school is it's not cultivated the way it could be.
Thanks, excellent film. It is, in fact, I think a great partner to examine life in terms of fleshing out more of the questions around the pieces around democracy. As another one of feckless, middle-class academic intellectuals who teaches, I have kind of a question that's around the kind of paradox, contradiction I see. There is this idea that, the Rousseauian idea that we are not born magically free, it's something we develop, that it is the responsibility of that system to reproduce itself through how it treats people. And yet I see simultaneously the people who gain expertise through education in a strange way become the most skeptical, and not in a healthy way, but in a unhelpful way, skeptical of democracy. I work with many engineers who can see these problems. I can explain to them the problems, and the answer is, you kind of point out, well, there'll be an algorithm, there'll be something that'll solve it. But I also see that even amongst people who seem sophisticated at facilitation and what we would think of as democracy. That, well, why would I share this power I might betray the people who vested me with the power, and so for that reason, I must be a tyrant and authoritarian because the people wanted me to be the authoritarian, as pointed out. Rule me, as I think Baldwin wisely points. And yet we continually come back to the question of, well, how do we address these issues? Education. Yeah. Ignoring the ways in which education itself is complicit in the recreation of it. So how do you sort of square that circle? How do you get to a place, I think as others pointed out, the people with what we would think of less as formal education tend to have more of a respect for and admiration for the potential of democracy, and less of what we would think of as the tactics, techniques, and self-confidence. Those with it are, I think, often the people at the heads of the world's largest organizations that are responsible for much wrong in the world are not people who are not educated. Yeah. They're not magically monsters. Yeah. So how do you sort of square that educational circle?
Well, I mean, I don't know if I can, but I mean, I'll give you some random thoughts. And one is I hear you raising the problem of technocracy, right? Which is this idea that sort of let the elites rule and bypass this problem of democracy and unruly people. And I'm not saying the people are always pretty. I mean, they're not, right? I mean, there are lots of instances of democracy run amok, and democracy always risks undermining itself and undermining its own legitimacy and devolving into tyranny. I mean, I think that's why Plato's warnings still hold, even if we disagree with how bizarre actually his philosophy is. If you don't want to take it literally, but that warning is still interesting. And so, it's interesting. So technocracy, this, idea of like let people who have the technique rule and govern, and they will get to their positions by sort of through education, through credentialing. I think we have to remember this, it's a related word. They're not 100% the same, but the word meritocracy was actually born of a satire, right? People know this, right? It was a satire written by this British guy, Michael Young, and he wrote this satirical novel about this world where the people who ruled thought they'd earned it because they had gone to the best schools. And then they became very smug and started hoarding all of the opportunities for themselves. And he wrote an essay for The Guardian 10 years ago that was like, wow, that was supposed to be a novel. It was quite prescient. I think the problem with, the problem for technocrats or people in the elite is they become disconnected from facts on the ground. So again, this is who has the necessary wisdom, who actually knows. I mean, in my own work on financial issues and consumer protections, there are lots of people who know how the financial system works in theory and who know what the rules are and the regulations and the protections allegedly in place, but it's our members who actually know how they're being hounded on the phone every day, how they were lied to, how forced arbitration, has screwed them over when they didn't understand what they were signing, right? Like, who has the pieces of the puzzle that we need. On the education front, I guess I will end with this. I mean, it's something that I think about a lot because I was raised in a very idealistic context. So I was unschooled in almost an anarchist way, and the idea was that human beings are inherently curious. Just kind of get rid of institutions and give them space, and they'll flourish and they'll grow. And it's a really lovely, beautiful idea that I think doesn't scale. And nobody emerges in a vacuum. I happen to also be raised in a house with lots of books and a piano and this and that and a lot of encouragement. But I think there's one thing positive, there's a very positive thing I took from it, and that is that, I think it separated a sort of, I learned to really appreciate authority that people had because they knew stuff that I wanted to know. And I was like, wow, you know stuff. I really want to learn from you. And I didn't confuse that with sort of them being authoritarian or like being able to punish me or give me bad grades, right? So I would always gravitate to mentors, always gravitate to people I wanted to learn from. And I think the way our educational system works is those two things are really mixed up. The person who's introducing you and supposed to help cultivate a love of a discipline is also has to discipline you because they have a class of like 50 kids they have to keep in line. So there's a chapter, I should just punt always to the book. There's a chapter in the book that is about sort of, the fact, I think one of the tensions in democracy is expertise and mass opinion. Like you can't, in my opinion, you can't have a modern world without expertise. We can't go back. And not everyone can be expert at everything, which means everyone should be kind of humble. And the question is, who does expertise serve? And is it expertise that has humility? But these are things, that it's, I think, a core tension of democracy and something that I look at in the book, and also look at, this sort of, again, this, our schools right now are very contradictory. They're both sort of engines of inequality and sort of people's best hope for sort of climbing and bettering themselves. And, but I think they could be so improved. But yeah. Thanks.
Thank you for coming
Yeah,
first.
thanks.
That was really interesting. So I'm kind of gonna, oh, okay. I'm gonna kind of make a comparison to like what I know a lot of. I'm part Hawaiian. I came from Hawaii. I was raised, and like I know I was taught a lot about like those our culture and stuff. And I do know that at one point, even though we had a monarchy and we had an elected monarch, all of the people were helping each other. It had some of the aspects of democracy that you kind of idealized in your film. And then things started going downhill when we brought in the money. Private like land, private land ownership and plantations came up, and things were driven by money, and it slowly kind of evolved into us losing sovereignty and all of the bad stuff that we don't like to talk about. And so in your opinion, like now that money is such a driving factor in like everything that everyone does, do you think that we can eventually come back to a state of democracy in any sense, even with the money?
Well, first, it's a great question. I mean, first, I think I did a little bit of reading on Hawaii and was so embarrassed by how much I don't know about it. But actually, there was a queen, right? And, and then foreign investors, American imperialists, basically were like, no, we're going to have democracy, which is really basically we're going to have capitalism, right? And so it was this interesting moment where actually it seems like the more just democratic thing would have been like to leave the monarch, right, the woman in place. And it was, an interesting history I need to learn a lot more about, but kind of there's so many twists. I think to me, the problem isn't necessarily money or even markets, right? It's that, we live it's when markets rule, right? And when you're dependent on the markets for, basic things for your life. So when a country offers universal health care, this is where I'm very confused, because I'm a Canadian who grew up in Georgia. But it's like, healthcare is just off the market. It's decommodified, right? It's just taking things out of the realm of the market. And I think right now, as the former Prime Minister of Greece says, we've handed over power to the markets to determine not just the value of things, but the value of ourselves and of our lives. And, we need to get those forces back under control. Now, I think we would have to really use our imaginations. How would we value things if the market can determine the value of everything? I don't think the left has actually the clearest answers to these questions yet. But as somebody said, I'm a hopeful person, actually. I think things change. We don't know what's happening next. And ideas that might sound radical, like decommodifying huge areas of our life, they're not that radical. There are all sorts of examples of them in this country and in other countries. Yeah, making money a public good, or public banks. Nebraska has a public bank. What's more American than Nebraska? North Dakota, even more American than Nebraska. I couldn't even think of it, North Dakota, it's so American. Yep.
So I'm an educator, and
I like your shirt.
oh, thanks. Yeah, it suits
very appropriate, right?
Yeah, I wasn't even, didn't realize that we would be spending so much time in Greece. But anyway, but the thing that really surprises me, and pretty much everyone says, well, it's about the education.
Yeah.
And, we have to educate Americans better. And, your movie doesn't really dive into that, but it certainly talks about it to a certain degree. And I think your movie also kind of pointed out, okay, this education panacea isn't
yeah, it's more
really,
complicated.
it's not really working as
Yeah.
well as people would think.
Yeah.
But from my perspective, I mean, I teach students. I try to encourage them to be responsible and to raise them to be, thinking individuals. And I grew up in a school, going to schools that were very, I think, good at what they did. I felt like I had a lot of good teachers. And in this country right now, there's this mass hypnosis that a large percentage of people that I grew up with that had the same teachers as me and that are intelligent people that learned those lessons, these people, it seems, have been hypnotized. And so to me, it's like, I don't know. It seems like the only way that education can be considered as a way out of this problem is if you enforce mandatory continuing education for people's entire lives. I mean,
Well, I think it's a really what would education under democracy look like? Would it stop when you're 18? Would it stop when you're 22? Or would there be a different...
But then I have the question of, okay, and who is deciding what is to be taught? So there's, there's so many problems with thinking that education is the solution.
Well, I think we live in a society that likes to think education is the solution. So the economy is bad. Well, teachers should educate people for the jobs of the future. But what if there are no jobs in the future, right? And so the burden, I think it can be part of this broader problem of sort of just like expecting teachers to do the work, right? Children are having discipline problems. Well, the teachers need to do, there are guns everywhere. Well, teachers should carry guns. I mean, they're supposed to solve the gun crisis, the economic crisis, stop the robots from taking our jobs, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, to me, it's, it's a power problem ultimately, right? Like the problem is the distribution of wealth and power in this world and the problems that flow from that, and teachers are sort of one factor, but can't fix these structural economic and political problems. And that's why, I think I do believe in education, and I'm obviously very much an intellectual person, and that's why it had to be in the film, but I had to problematize that solution, exactly as you said. It's not a panacea, and I think education would really transform if we had a more democratic society and a more democratic economy, right? Like it's sad, I almost want to say we take the 8-hour day for granted, but actually people work 60-hour weeks now, right? But it's like, why does school last the length it does every day? Well, because it matches the parents' time at work, not because it's the maximum time frame for a young mind to be learning, right? So I don't know, maybe in a more democratic, fair world, the days would be shorter, but it would be something you could do your whole life. Like we don't really know what school would be like in a democratic society. But the question of who does the curriculum, I mean, hopefully, I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. But I would imagine, this is where I'm sort of a materialist. The curriculum would flow from right now we have certain material relations, and the curriculum serves the interest of society as it exists, and in a different world, it would look very differently. I mean, right now I work in the higher education space, and we see so many people, partly out of fear of their student debt, being pushed into vocational, supposedly practical jobs, and not studying the humanities, not studying the things they love, and going into fields like engineering or sort of medical technicians, all sorts of things, just going to school and going into debt so that they can get jobs. So we see already that the material, economic realities shape what people are studying. So I think shift those and other things will shift, if that makes sense.
The world, students protest against universities raising fees.
Yeah.
I find all the focus on student debt, but not on the fees itself. itself being charged by the universities.
So she's saying that in other places, people focus on raising fees instead of, and here.
Students protest all over the world at universities.
Yeah, students protest here when their individual campuses raise fees without a doubt. I think that that's absolutely true. The development of student debt was sort of one of these like fixes that went awry, right? Because it was devised, the federal government was trying to devise a way to sort of equalize access to education. It was like, let's extend loans. And there has been simultaneously, state disinvestment that has caused tuition to rise. Federal disinvestment, but also a lot of, disinvestment at the state level. But I think students do protest fees. But I think right now, people, as a condition, what unites students across these different campuses and across states is the student debt is what unites them. And also, this is the other problem. You're on campus, you're 19. You've been told your whole life school costs $50,000. You're like, okay. And maybe it raises in tuition the next year is $53,000. It really hits people when they're in their mid-20s. When they start to realize, they start to get a different sense of time, they start to realize they're not gonna just get their dream job. And that's when, so what we found organizing around student debt, we initially thought, oh, we're gonna organize with students. No, you organize with people slightly later in their life who are having trouble paying. So that's part of why, and those are people ready to organize and thinking more about how it affects their lives, where students are just focused on, a lot of students have jobs, a lot of students are overburdened, they're not really, and they're doing what they were told to do, which is to graduate and be successful. Yep.
Hi. I had a question, a clarification question, and then a comment about the education. So the professor at the last end, she said, towards the end, she said, democracy is based on exclusion.
Yeah.
We need to know who we are. And I was a little kind of trying to figure out what she was saying.
Yeah.
And I wondered if she was saying, Eleanor Ostrom, who wrote about the commons, she also talked about boundaries. You need boundaries to govern the commons. You just can't have a free-for-all because that doesn't work. So I wondered if that professor was talking about boundaries rather than about excluding people.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't think and I think that just because there's boundaries doesn't mean it's, boundaries can be porous. But I think there's this question of,
like rules. I mean,
rules and accountability.
Right, and that's what Eleanor Ostrom said. There needs to be rules. There need to be penalties if people break the rules, graded penalties.
Yeah.
And even the guy from who lived in Pakistan said rules.
Yeah.
That it's important to people to know where they're at, and the rules have to apply to everybody, just not to a certain group of people.
Yeah, and that's why I thought it was important to have him say that, because otherwise it can be, just to sort of give the sense of, he's someone who's lived in a failed state. He knows what it's like to have there not be accountability or any semblance of justice, and I think his perspective is valuable. But I think your point about the commons is a good one, right? It's that some sort of boundaries and boundedness can be necessary to know decisions are legitimate, to know where power is operating.
And what happens when,
Yeah, how to manage something. So I think,
anyway, and the question, for the past few months I've been helped, like I said, but we've been studying building community wealth and resilience. And one of the things we've learned is when you talk about wealth, you're not only talking about money, there are assets, you're talking about assets. So there are 8 types of wealth: individual, intellectual, cultural, social, political, financial, which also means built infrastructure, and there is natural. So any case, I was in the Western region yesterday, and we asked people, and this was a lot of people from community-based organizations, health departments. There was a banker also in the room who was very disappointed people didn't talk too much about finance, but we were a lot of social enterprises. So we asked people to choose two types of wealth that they felt they were strong at. And so we found a lot of similar colors. So people in our group, most of them were part of a social enterprise, were either very strong in the individual, intellectual, or the social, political, cultural. The ones which surprised everybody when we, after the discussions we put up where we were strong, the natural, because this was in the Western region, we were just surrounded by nature. That was the asset in this community. Yet very few people actually linked with the natural wealth in their work. And finance, which we kind of knew we wouldn't be very strong out there. But seeing it right there visually, I mean, we didn't give any answers. It kind of, I think the national part took everybody by surprise because everyone in the room obviously cared about it.
Yeah, but
So I think one of the reasons the movie I was thinking is not depressing was because it didn't give answers, but it showed the complexity and kind of made us feel solidarity.
Oh, good, I
And
like that,
maybe we have questions that we can feel, we can explore.
yeah.
That's how I felt in the room, at least yesterday. We didn't give answers, but people looked at it, and the question of why don't we do this, you know, when it's so important to us? Maybe, I'm just wondering, because I think your movie raised a lot of questions, which is helpful.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And maybe that's a good place to wrap up too, because the questions, I think the film is based in an honest inquiry, right? And so I wasn't, when I say to Wendy, I really wrestled with making democracy the theme of this film, I actually meant it. I mean, I think there are a lot of questions that we have to keep asking and sort of reassessing our thinking on. And, and I think even as I began this film, I sort of thought, oh, well, of course, the legitimate real film on democracy would be sort of more definitive, right? It would begin with this montage, beginning at the beginning, whenever that is, and going to the present. And, I thought about it and I thought, no, there could be, every single person can make their own film about democracy. And that's why it begins with Sylvia Federici and I in this room looking at this painting of, do you want to take a journey with two weird intellectual women and think about democracy, right? This is one person's journey. Everyone in the film is somehow connected to me. These are my interests, right? I work on issues of indebtedness and financial justice. I am connected to the activists in Miami and in North Carolina. And, and one person doesn't have all of the answers. And I think that, I always wanted to make intellectual films. I'm an intellectual, but for me, an intellectual is someone, it's not about the professing. It's actually about the questioning, right? And reclaiming questioning and curiosity as actually the core of the intellectual mode. And for me, that's a feminist mode, right? Because I think questioning is seen as sort of weaker and feminine, right? And you're supposed to be, providing this like authoritative voice, voicing over the film with all the things you know. And so I'm trying to present a different model of intellectual engagement. And so the moments when I doubted my approach, I would just imagine to myself, what would it be like if Werner Herzog's films were voiced over with a Valley Girl accent, And just be like, be afraid of having a different voice and asking questions, because, that's actually how you freaking learn. So anyway, thank you for being here with me.